right, everybody, we are on chapter 5 of Gatsby. So find chapter 5 in your PDF, even though I'm reading in a book. I'm sorry I was not able to get you guys the books, but it should be all right. All right. When I came home to West Egg that night, I was afraid for a moment that my house was on fire. 2 o'clock and the whole corner of the peninsula was blazing with light, which fell unreal on the shrubbery and made thin, elongating glints upon the roadside wires. Turning a corner, I saw that it was Gatsby's house, lit from tower to cellar. At first I thought it was another party, a wild rout that had resolved itself into hide-and-go-seek or sardines in the box, with all the house thrown up into the game. But there wasn't a sound, only wind in the trees, which blew the wires and made the lights go off and on again as if the house had winked into the darkness. As my taxi groaned away, I saw Gatsby walking toward me across the lawn. "Your place looks like the World's Fair," I said. "Does it?" He turned his eyes toward it absently. "I haven't been glancing into some of the rooms. Let's go to Coney Island, old sport, in my car." "It's too late." "Well, suppose we take a plunge in the swimming pool. I haven't made use of it all summer." "Gotta go to bed." "All right." He waited, looking at me with suppressed eagerness. "I talked with Miss Baker," I asked after a moment. "I'm going to call up Davy tomorrow and invite her over here to tea." "Oh, that's all right," he said carelessly. "I don't want to put you at any trouble." "What day would suit you?" "What day would suit you?" he corrected me quickly. "I don't want to put any trouble, you see." He considered for a moment, then with reluctance, "I want to get the grass cut," he said. We both looked at the grass. There was a sharp line where my ragged lawn ended and the darker, well-kept expanse of his began. I suspected that he meant my grass. "There's another thing," he said uncertainly and hesitated. "Would you like me to put it off for a few days?" I asked. "Oh, it isn't about that, at least." He fumbled with a series of beginnings. Why, look here, old sport. You don't make much money, do you?" "Not very much." This seemed to reassure him, and he continued more confidently. "I thought you didn't. If you'll pardon my eye, you see, I carry on a little business on the side, a sort of sideline, you understand. And I thought that if you don't make very much, you're selling bonds, aren't you, old sport?" "Trying to." "Well, this would interest you. It wouldn't take up much of your time, and you might pick up a nice bit of money. It happens to be rather confidential sort of thing." I realize now that under different circumstances, that conversation might have been one of the crises of my life. But because the offer was obviously and tactlessly for a service to be rendered, I had no choice except to cut him off there. "I've got my hands full," I said. "I must oblige, but I couldn't take on much any more work." You wouldn't have to do my business with Wolfsheim." Evidently he thought that I was shying away from the Gonignition mentioned at lunch, but I assured him he was wrong. He waited a moment longer, hoping I'd begin a conversation, but I was too absorbed to be responsive, so he went unwillingly home. The evening had made me lightheaded and happy. I think I walked into a deep sleep as I entered my front door. So I don't know whether or not Gatsby went to Coney Island, or for how many hours he glanced into rooms while his house blazed gaudily on. I caught up Daisy from the office next morning and invited her to come over for tea. "Don't bring Tom," I warned. "What?" "Don't bring Tom." "Who is Tom?" she asked innocently. The day agreed upon was pouring rain. At 11 o'clock, a man in a raincoat, dragging a lawn-mower, tapped at my front door and said that Mr. Gatsby had sent him over to cut my grass. This reminded me that I had forgotten to tell my Finn to come back, so I drove into West Egg Village to search for her among soggy, whitewashed alleys and to buy some cups and lemons and flowers. The flowers were unnecessary, for at 2 o'clock Greenhouse arrived from Gatsby with innumerable receptacles to contain it. An hour later the front door opened nervously and Gatsby in a white flannel suit, silver shirt, and gold-colored tie hurried in. He was pale and there was dark signs of sleeplessness beneath his eyes. "Is everything all right?" he asked immediately. "The grass looks fine. Is that what you mean?" "What grass?" he inquired blankly. "Oh, the grass in the yard." He looked out the window at it, but, judging from his expression, I don't believe he saw a thing. "Looks very good," he remarked vaguely. One of the papers said that the thoughts on the rain would stop at 4. I think it was the journal. Have you got everything you need in the shape of tea? I took him into the pantry where he looked a little reproachfully at the fin. Together we scrutinized the 12 lemon cakes from the delicatessen shop. Will they do? I asked. Of course, they're fine, he added hollowly. Old sport. The rain cooled about 3:30 to a dampness through which occasional thin drops swam like dew. Gatsby looked with vacant eyes through a copy of Clay's Economics, starting at the finished tread that shook the kitchen floor and peering toward the bleared windows from time to time, as if a series of invisible but alarming happenings were taking place outside. Finally he got up and informed me in an uncertain voice that he was going home. Why's that? Nobody's coming to tea. It's too late. He looked at his watch as if there was some pressing demand on his time elsewhere. I can't wait all day. Don't be silly, it's just 2 minutes to 4. He sat down miserably, as if I had pushed him, and simultaneously there was the sound of a motor turning into my lane. We both jumped up, and a little horror myself, I went out into the yard. Under the dripping bare lilac trees, a large open car was coming up the drive. It stopped. Daisy's face, tipped sideways beneath a 3-cornered lavender hat, looked out at me with a bright, ecstatic smile. Is this absolutely where you live, my dearest one? The exhilarating ripple of her voice was a wild tonic in the rain. I had to follow the sound. I had to follow the sound of it for a moment, up and down with my ear alone, before any words came through. A damp streak of hair lay a dash of blue paint across her cheek, and her hands were wet with glistening drops as I took it to help from the car. Are you in love with me? She said low in my ear. Or why did I have to come alone? That's the secret of Castle Rackmaret. Tell your chauffeur to go away and spend the hour. Come back in an hour, Freddie. Ferdy. Then, in a grave murmur, his name is Ferdy. Does the gasoline affect his nose? I don't think so, she said innocently. Why? We went in. To my overwhelming surprise, the living room was deserted. Well, that's funny, I exclaimed. What's funny? She turned her head as there was a light, dignified knocking at the front door. I went out and opened it. Gatsby, pale as death, with his hands plunged like weights in his coat pockets, was standing in a puddle of water, glaring tragically into my eyes. With his hands still in his coat pockets, he stalked by me into the hall, turned sharply as if he were on a wire, and disappeared into the living room. It wasn't a bit funny. Aware of the loud beating of my own heart, I pulled the door to against the increasing rain. For half a minute, there wasn't a sound. Then, from the living room, I heard a sort of choking murmur and part of a laugh, followed by Daisy's voice on a clear artificial note. I certainly am awfully glad to see you again. A pause. It endured horribly. I had nothing to do in the hall, so I went into the room. Gatsby, his hands still in his pockets, was reclining against the mantelpiece in a strained counterfeit of perfect ease, even of boredom. His head leaned back so far that it rested against the face of a defunct mantelpiece clock, and from the position his distraught eyes stared down at Daisy, who was sitting frightened but grateful on the edge of a stiff chair. We've met before, muttered Gatsby. His eyes glanced momentarily at me, and his lips parted with an abortive attempt to a laugh. Luckily, the clock took this moment to tilt dangerously at the pressure of his head, whereupon he turned and caught it with trembling fingers and set it back into place. Then he sat down, rigidly, his elbow on the arm of the sofa and his chin in his hand. I'm sorry about the clock, he said. My own face had now assumed a deep, tropical burn. I couldn't muster up a single commonplace out of 1,000 in my head. So this is really awkward, right? It's an old clock, I told them idiotically. I think we all believed for a moment that it had smashed into pieces on the floor. We haven't met for many years, said Daisy, her voice as matter-of-fact as it could ever be. 5 years next November. The automatic quality of Gatsby's answers set us all back at least another minute. I had them both on their feet with the desperate suggestion that they help me make tea in the kitchen with the demoniac Finn brought it in on a tray. Amid the welcome confusion of cups and cakes, a certain physical decency established itself. Gatsby got himself into a shadow and, while Daisy and I talked, looked conscientiously from one to the other of us with tense, unhappy eyes. However, a calmness wasn't at an end itself. I made an excuse at the first possible moment and got to my feet. "Where are you going?" demanded Gatsby in immediate alarm. Hold on. Gatsby got himself into his shadow and, while Daisy and I talked, looked conscientiously from one to the other of us with tense, unhappy eyes. However, as calmness wasn't an end in itself, I made an excuse at the first possible moment and got to my feet. "Where are you going?" demanded Gatsby in immediate alarm. "I'll be back. I've got to speak to you about something before you go." He followed me wildly onto the kitchen closed door and whispered, "Oh, God!" in a miserable way. "What's the matter?" "This is a terrible mistake," he said, shaking his head from side to side. "A terrible, terrible mistake." "You're just embarrassed, that's all." And luckily, I added, "Daisy's embarrassed too." "She's embarrassed?" he repeated incredulously. "Just as much as you are." "Don't talk so loud." "You're acting like a little boy," I broke out impatiently. "Not only that, but you're rude. Daisy's sitting in there all alone." He raised his hand to stop my words, looked at me with unforgettable reproach, and, opening the door cautiously, went back into the other room. I walked out the back way, just as Gatsby had when he had made his nervous circuit from the house half an hour before, and ran for a huge black knotted tree, whose massed leaves made a fabric against the rain. Once more it was pouring, and my irregular lawn, well shaved by Gatsby's gardener, abounded in small muddy swamps and prehistoric marshes. There was nothing to look at from under the tree except Gatsby's enormous house as I stared at it like the cant of his church steeple for half an hour. A brewer had built it early in the period craze, a decade before, and there was a story that he'd agreed to pay 5 years of taxes on all the neighboring cottages if the owners would have their roofs thatched with straw. Perhaps the refusal took the heart out of his plan to found a family. He went into the immediate decline. His children sold his house with the black wreath still on the door. Americans, while occasionally willing to be serfs, had always been obstinate about being peasantry. After half an hour, the sun shone again, and the grocer's automobile rounded Gatsby's drive with the raw material for his servant's dinner. I felt sure he wouldn't eat a spoonful. A maid began opening the upper windows of his house, appeared momentarily in each, and leaning from a large central bay, spat meditatively into the garden. It was time I went back. While the rain continued, it had seemed like the murmur of their voices, rising and swelling a little now and then with the gusts of emotion. But in the new silence, I found that the silence had fallen within the house, too. I went in, after making every possible noise in the kitchen, short of pushing over the stove, but I don't believe that they heard a sound. They were sitting at either end of the couch, looking at each other as if some question had been asked, or was in the air, and every vestige of embarrassment was gone. Daisy's face was smeared with tears, and when I came in, she jumped up and began wiping at it with her handkerchief before a mirror. But there was a change in Gatsby that was simply confounding. He literally glowed. Without a word or a gesture or an exultation, a new well-being radiated from him and filled the little room. "Oh, hello, old sport," he said, as if he hadn't seen me for years. I thought for a moment he was going to shake hands. "It stopped raining." "Has it?" When he realized what I was talking about, that's where the twinkle bells of sunshine in the room. He smiled like a weatherman, like an ecstatic patron of recurrent light, and repeated the news to Daisy. "What do you think of that? It stopped raining." "I'm glad, Jay." Her throat, full of aching, grieving beauty, told only of her unexpected joy. "I want you and Daisy to come over to my house," he said. "I'd like to show her around." "You're sure you want me to come?" "Absolutely, old sport." Daisy went upstairs to wash her face. Too late, I thought with humiliation of my towels, while Gatsby and I waited on the lawn. "My house looks well, doesn't it?" he demanded. "See how the whole front of it catches the light?" I agreed that it was splendid. "Yes." His eyes went over to it, every arched door and square tower. It took me just 3 years to earn the money that bought it. I thought you inherited your money. I did, old sport, he said automatically. But I lost most of it in the big panic, the panic of the war. I think he hardly knew what he was saying, for when I asked him what his business was in it, he answered, "That's my affair," before he realized that it wasn't an appropriate reply. "Oh, I've been in several things," he corrected himself. "I was in the drug business, and then I was in the oil business, but I'm not in either now." He looked at me with more attention. "Do you mean you've been thinking over what I proposed the other night?" Before I could answer, Daisy came out of the house, and in 2 rows of brass buttons on her dress gleamed in the sunlight. "That huge place there?" she cried, pointing. "Do you like it?" "I love it, but I don't see how you can live there all alone." "I keep it always full of interesting people, night and day, people who do interesting things, celebrated people." Instead of taking the shortcut along the Sound, we went down to the road and entered by the big postern. With enchanting murmurs, Daisy admired this aspect of the feudal silhouette against the sky, admired the gardens, the sparkling door of the jonquils, and the frothy odor of the hawthorn and plum blossoms, and the pale gold odor of "Kiss Me at the Gate." It was strange to reach the marble steps and find no stir of bright dresses in and out of the door, and hear no sound but the bird voices in the trees. And inside, as we wandered through Marie Antoinette music rooms and restoration salons, I felt that there were more guests concealed behind every couch and table, under orders to be breathlessly silent until we had passed through. As Gatsby closed the door of the Merton College library, I could have sworn I heard the owl-eyed man break into ghostly laughter. We went upstairs, through period bedrooms swathed in rose and lavender, silk and vivid with the new flowers, through dressing rooms and pool rooms and bathrooms, with sunken baths intruding into one chamber while a disheveled man in pajamas was doing liver exercises on the floor. It was Mr. Klipspringer, the boarder. I had seen him wandering around hungrily about the beach that morning. Finally we came to Gatsby's own apartment, a bedroom and a bath and an Adam's study, where we sat down and drank a glass of some chartreuse he took from the cupboard in a wall. He hadn't once ceased looking at Daisy, and I think he revalued everything in his house according to the measure of response it drew from her well-loved eyes. Sometimes, too, he stared around at the possessions in a dazed way, as though in her actual and astounding presence none of it was any longer real. Once he nearly toppled down the flight of stairs. His bedroom was the simplest room of all, except where the dresser was garnished with a toilet set of pure dull gold. Daisy took the brush with delight and smoothed her hair, whereupon Gatsby sat down and shaded his eyes and began to laugh. "It's the funniest thing, old sport," he said hilariously. "I can't, when I try to—" He had passed visibly through 2 states and was entering upon a third. After his embarrassment and his unreasoning joy, he was consumed with wonder at her presence. He had been full of the idea so long, dreamed it right through to the end, waited with his teeth set, so to speak, at an inconceivable pitch of intensity. Now in the reaction he was running down like an overwound clock.